The Portraits in Black History series was produced with the goal of publishing the many positive contributions made to American and world society by people of African descent, to challenge the many negative stereotypes that daily bombard us, and to celebrate the accomplishments of a people who rose up from slavery to national and world leadership. As you listen to the records of the lives of some of the people being portrayed, you will hear some accounts of racial oppression and brutality. This information may make some listeners uncomfortable, but it is the historical context that framed the lives of the characters being portrayed. To remove the characters from their real-life context would be intellectually dishonest and would diminish the accomplishments of these heroes being portrayed. Imagine celebrating the skills, endurance, and accomplishments of Muhammad Ali without juxtaposing him against Smoking Joe Frazier or the towering George Foreman. The hero is measured by the power and determination of the opponent. With this in mind, our characters are portrayed within the context of the times in which they live. And now, we present A Portrait in Black History.
The Life of Frederick Douglass, written by Kenneth E. Sullivan, Ph.D., copyright 2010 by Emerge Curriculum Publishing, LLC. Read by Kenneth E. Sullivan. And now, the life of Frederick Douglass. It is not certain exactly what year Frederick Douglass was born, but as nearly as can be estimated, he was born in the year 1818 in Tuckahoe, Maryland, near Eastland, Maryland, not far from Chesapeake Bay. Douglass remembers that in 1835 he heard his master say to someone that he was about 17 years old. Slaves were usually not told their date of birth. This was the kind of information the masters felt that a slave simply did not need to know. Frederick, like so many slaves before him, was not allowed to inquire of his master concerning the subject of his age. Such inquiries would be deemed improper and impertinent. Frederick Bailey was the son of Harriet Bailey and reportedly her slave master. His maternal grandparents were Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both of whom were black. He was separated from his mother at infancy and did not have the opportunity to know her. It was a common practice of slave masters in that part of Maryland to separate children from their parents at an early age. Often before a child was a year old, it was taken away from its mother and placed in the care of an old woman who had become too feeble to work the fields. The probable reasoning behind this action was to prevent the child from bonding with and developing a natural affection toward its mother and the mother toward the child. Frederick never saw his mother more than 4 or 5 times, and only at night. She had been hired out to Mr. Stewart, who lived 12 miles away. The few times she was permitted, she would walk the full distance after a full day's work in the field and lie down beside him, but would be gone before he would awaken the next day. She died when Frederick was about 7 years old. He was not permitted to visit or see her after she became ill and was later told about her death. Because he never had the opportunity to bond with his mother or ever really get to know her, when she passed, Frederick did not mourn the loss. The news of her death was received with little emotion. Frederick Douglass was a mulatto child, and mulatto children, those usually conceived by white men and a black slave, always took on the status of the mothers and became slaves themselves. This law accommodated the lustful nature as well as the greed of the slave master. It was a common practice for a slave master to sire a child, commit that child to the life of a slave, and later sell him or her on the auction block. Because of this mulatto custom, Frederick was destined to live the life of a slave rather than that of a son. Mulatto children had an especially hard life because there was a great deal of resentment against them on the part of the wife of the slave master. If the slave master was in any way partial to the mulatto slave, who was his own flesh and blood, his jealous wife would take out her anger and frustration on the slave. The very presence of the mulatto slave was a constant reminder to the slave master's wife of her husband's infidelity, and there was nothing the slave could do to erase that offense. This poor innocent slave was the object of constant torment and abuse. Often the situation between a slave master and his wife became so unbearable that the mulatto slave was sold away. Every year, thousands of mulatto children were born to their slave masters, suffered the brutalities of a jealous wife, coupled with the suffering which was common to the life of a slave, and were finally sold away to solve the problem. In his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Frederick laments the peculiarity of this contorted institution, exposing how it created a condition where it was normal to see a father rule over his own child and count it as nothing more than livestock, and to see one brother tie up another who was the child of the same father and brutalize him with a cowskin whip. This inhumane system, known as chattel slavery, dehumanized the slave master by comforting and affirming him in his vice and creating a culture and society where such blatant immorality was encouraged. Indeed, the Southern genteel society was one where those who trafficked in human flesh were even envied by those who did not have the good fortune of owning another human being. Frederick's master was Captain Aaron Anthony. Perhaps he was referred to as captain because he sailed a boat up and down the Chesapeake Bay. Captain Anthony was not a rich slave owner. He owned about 30 slaves and 2 or 3 farms. Captain Anthony employed an overseer named Mr. Plummer, who was a man with a mean and brutal disposition. Mr. Plummer usually carried a cowskin whip and a heavy cudgel, a large stick, which he kept handy and ready to use if a slave demonstrated the slightest offense. Plummer was a merciless man who, according to Frederick, would slash and cut the women's heads so terribly that Captain Anthony would reprimand him. Not that Captain Anthony was a sympathetic owner. He was also a cruel man, and it required a great amount of cruelty to compel him to complain against the overseer. In his narrative, Frederick recounts that Captain Anthony, like Mr. Plummer, took pleasure in whipping his slaves. He recalls being awakened by the heart-wrenching screams of his aunt, whom the captain would tie to the joist and whipped until she was literally covered with blood. Captain Anthony could not be swayed by the pitiful pleas, prayers, or tears from a victim that he was bound and determined to torture and brutalize. In fact, the pleas for compassion provoked him to increase the severity of the punishment rather than stir any feelings of pity for the victim. Frederick remembers that his Aunt Hester was a very beautiful woman and that she was closely guarded by Anthony. He had warned her not to go out evenings and to stay away from a slave on another plantation named Ned Roberts. Captain Anthony saw Ned as a rival and would not share Hester with him. On this particular occasion, Hester was caught, not only away from the farm, but in the company of Ned Roberts. Frederick describes how Anthony took her into the kitchen and stripped her naked from the waist up, tied her hands with a heavy rope, and had her stand on a stool under a hook in the joist. He tied the rope to the hook, which stretched her body to its full length so that she stood on her toes. He muttered a few expletives, rolled up his sleeves, and began to lay on the heavy lash. Hester's back soon began to bleed as Anthony laid on the lash, and the flow of blood became increasingly heavy and dripped to the floor as she shrieked in agony. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. Where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest, said Frederick. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until fatigued would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. Frederick recalls being so terrified that he hid in a closet expecting that he would be next. I had never seen anything like it, he said. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. This was only the first of many brutal beatings that Frederick was destined to witness and endure. When he was 6 years old, his grandmother took him to the big house, the house of Captain Thomas All. This was the beginning of his life as a slave. Captain All was the son-in-law of Captain Aaron Anthony. Anthony, Frederick's master, was Colonel Lloyd's superintendent over all the other overseers. They lived in one house on Lloyd's home plantation. The plantation was located 12 miles north of Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. The Lloyd plantation produced an abundant crop of tobacco, corn, and wheat. Colonel Lloyd kept 300 or 400 slaves on his own plantation and owned a large number of more slaves on his neighboring farms. In his book, Frederick Douglass, Rising Up from Slavery, Francis Ruffin describes the meager rations of food and clothing which were the slaves' common allotment. Once a month, the adult slaves received 8 pounds of pork or fish and 1 bushel of cornmeal. The annual allotment of clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, and a linen jacket for summer, 1 pair of wool trousers and jacket for winter, and 1 pair of shoes. The young slave children received 2 coarse knee-length linen shirts that they sometimes wore out before the next year. Those who wore out their clothes were forced to go naked until the following year. The children were fed cornmeal mush mixed with hot water and poured into a trough similar to that which was used to slop hogs. They used oyster shells as eating utensils to scoop the mush into their mouths like little pigs. According to Frederick, it was not uncommon to see slave children nearly naked in the dead of winter, having only a coarse shirt hanging barely to their knees as a covering for their bodies. On the coldest night, Frederick stole a coarse burlap bag and used it for a sleeping bag. I would crawl into this bag and there slept on the cold, damp clay floor with my head in and feet out, Frederick explained. The life of a slave was a miserable one. Frederick wrote about his misery. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In the coldest winters, I was kept almost naked. My feet have been so cracked with frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. Slaves did not have beds to sleep in. They were given a coarse blanket to cover the mud floor, which was common in the slave shacks. Frederick described a number of overseers who were in the employ of his master. Mr. Sevier was among the worst kind of overseer who took pride in whipping slaves. His language was said to be as abusive as his whip. Frederick reported seeing him whip a woman until the blood ran for half an hour, and the whole horrid ordeal was done in the presence of her pleading children. Mr. Sevier died early and was replaced by Mr. Hopkins, who was referred to as a good overseer when compared to Mr. Sevier. He whipped the slaves, but seemed to take no particular delight in it, and the whipping were not accompanied by the abusive language that was such a dominant part of Mr. Sevier's demeanor. One of Frederick's jobs was to run errands for Lucretia Auld, Thomas Auld's wife. Lucretia came to like Frederick and treated him with decency. When he turned 8, she told him that he would be sent to the house of Hugh Auld, Lucretia's brother-in-law. Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and owned a shipyard. When Frederick arrived in Maryland, he had the task of running errands for Sophia and caring for their infant son. Sophia also came to like Frederick and began teaching him to read and write. When her husband found out about it, he became very angry and sternly rebuked her, warning her that it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write, and that they might begin to think for themselves and rebel against their masters. He further warned that if they could forge papers declaring themselves free and escape to the North, they would do so. From this point, Sophia started to act differently toward Frederick, treating him more like livestock than a human being. But he had learned from Mr. Auld's outbursts that the key to freedom from slavery was to learn all he could. He had learned enough from Sophia to continue learning on his own, and to supplement his self-education, he paid the poor white children scraps of food to teach him. He read everything he could get his hands on. He learned about the institution of slavery, about the free states, and about abolitionists and how some slaves rebel. The more he learned, the more he detested his bondage. He recalled his thoughts. Men like Captain Anthony and Hugh Auld are nothing but a band of robbers who had gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. One of his favorite books was The Colombian Orator, a collection of essays about freedom and democracy. He used money he had managed to squirrel away from running errands to purchase a copy of the book. During this time, Captain Anthony died, and his property was divided between his daughter and 2 sons. Frederick had to return to the Lloyd plantation and wait to see who would be his new master. The slaves were grouped with the livestock and the rest of the property belonging to the Anthony estate. Soon it was determined that Frederick would be given to Lucretia Auld. He was immediately returned to Hugh and Sophia Auld in Baltimore. But in 1833, 1 year later, Lucretia Auld also died, and Frederick, now 15, became the property of her husband, Thomas Auld. Auld brought him back to a farm in St. Michael's, Maryland, to work in the field. Auld was a cruel master who overworked and underfed his slaves and would apply the lash upon the least provocation. Frederick was miserable living as a field slave. He was beaten often, but his heart went out to another slave who was beaten even more unmercifully. This poor slave had the misfortune of having his hand severely mutilated in a fire, which caused him to be very clumsy. He often paid for his handicap by being brutally and mercilessly beaten. Frederick had a special distaste for Southern white preachers because they twisted the Bible to justify their dastardly practices, preaching that it was a slave's duty to obey his master. According to Frederick, a religious slaveholder was the absolute worst kind of master a slave could have. He described them as far exceeding other slaveholders in the amount and the severity of cruelty and hardship they could inflict upon a slave. Thomas Auld whipped his slaves while reading from the Bible. Auld was known as one of the most devout men in the community, but his hypocrisy appalled Frederick. He thought Frederick to be less than subordinate and totally submissive, so he sent him to a slave breaker named Edward Covey. Edward Covey had a reputation for breaking stubborn and rebellious slaves. When Frederick was sent to Covey, he tried to comply with his demands but was reprimanded and whipped for the most trivial offenses. After being in Covey's possession for only 1 week, he accidentally let a team of oxen run wild and was given a serious beating by Covey. He was beaten so often and so brutally that he began to feel broken. Covey fed the slaves well who were in his care, but he worked them unmercifully without rest. He spied on the slaves from the bushes to keep them from resting, and whenever he caught a slave resting, he would jump out on him from the bushes and beat him with a thick branch. On one occasion, Covey worked Frederick so hard until his strength gave out and he collapsed. Mr. Covey began to kick and beat him, but he was out cold. When Frederick regained consciousness, he managed to walk back to the Auld farm and beg Thomas Auld to let him stay, but Auld showed no mercy and returned him to Covey. When Covey began to tie him to a post to whip him again, Frederick decided to fight back. Frederick wrote in his narrative, "I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me, and I held on to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes, another slave, for help. Hughes came, and while Covey held me, attempted to tie my hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes and had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but Covey also. When he saw Covey bending over with pain, his courage quailed. I told him that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and I was determined to be used so no longer. I seized him with both hands by the collar and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground." Frederick wrote that the fight lasted for 2 hours and Covey finally gave up. To save face, he told Frederick that he would not have whipped him so severely if he had not resisted. "The truth was," said Frederick, "he had not whipped me at all." Frederick could have been killed for resisting a master or overseer, but Covey's reputation as a slave breaker would have been ruined if he had let it be known that he could not handle a 16-year-old boy. Frederick discovered that those who offer the least resistance are the ones who are most often whipped. He was never whipped again while in Covey's possession. Frederick gained a sense of self-esteem and respect after the incident with Covey. After 1 year under the slave breaker, he was sent to work for a farmer named William Freeland. Frederick respected one thing above others about Mr. Freeland, and that was the fact that although he lived in a community of religious slaveholders, he did not conceal his actions as a slave owner in a shroud of false Christianity. There were 2 religious slaveholders that stuck out above others in Frederick's mind, Reverend Daniel Wheaton and Reverend Whigby Hopkins. Both men were ministers in the Reformed Methodist Church. Wheaton kept several slaves, one of which was a woman whose back was kept raw by regular beatings from his lash. Wheaton whipped his slaves regularly and without provocation just to remind them of his authority. Reverend Hopkins was even worse than Wheaton. He whipped his slaves as a preventative measure, not waiting until they had committed an offense. It was a slave's worst nightmare to end up in the ownership of the religious Reverend Rigby Hopkins. Yet he made the highest profession of religion than any man in the county. Frederick reported that Hopkins prided himself in long prayers, regular church attendance, and careful observance of all the rules and trappings of his religion. Mr. Freeland, while not claiming to be in any way religious, was relatively fair as slave masters went. But fairness was not enough for Frederick at this time in his life. He wanted his freedom. He secretly started an illegal school for the other slaves and began plotting his escape. However, before his plan could be launched, one of the slaves turned informant, and Frederick and the other plotters were seized and thrown in jail. He was sure he would be sold further down south to an even more horrifying existence, but to his surprise, his master released him from jail and sent him back to his brother Hugh Auld. Hugh Auld leased Frederick out as a caulker in a shipyard. He was learning the caulking trade when he was attacked and nearly blinded in one eye by white caulkers who felt threatened by black caulkers. Hugh Auld tried to take the men to court, but without anyone as a witness, the case was dropped. A black man, slave or free, was not allowed to testify in court. After he recovered from his injuries, Frederick began working at a shipyard where Hugh Auld worked. Within a year's time, he was being paid the highest wage for a tradesman at his level. Frederick had to turn most of his earnings over to Mr. Auld, who would give him 1 penny for every dollar he was paid. He began to resent more and more having his wages stolen by Auld and began thinking more and more about escaping. He met a group of educated black men and began regular discussions with them about books, politics, freedom, and democracy. He also met a woman that he greatly admired named Anna Murray. The more he got to know Anna, the more he grew to admire her, and they later became engaged. On one occasion, he was late turning his wages over to his master, and in retaliation, Auld took away his privileges. This infuriated Frederick, so he began to make plans for his escape. He borrowed money from Anna for a ticket, borrowed a sailor's uniform from a friend, and papers identifying him as a sailor, and on September 3, 1838, he boarded a train for Wilmington, Delaware. Delaware was a slave state, so Frederick was on edge all the way through the state, knowing that if he was caught, it meant death or life as a field hand in the Deep South. From Wilmington, he boarded a steamship for Philadelphia. Once in Philadelphia, he was able to breathe easier. From Philadelphia, he boarded a train for New York, and once there, lost himself in the crowd. Frederick was filled with excitement and joy, but he could not be completely at ease because slave catchers roamed the streets searching for runaway slaves to return to their masters for bounty. Frederick wandered the streets for several days until he met a black sailor who introduced him to David Ruggles, who assisted in the operation of an underground railroad station. The Underground Railroad was a system of people who used their homes, barns, basements, caves, and other shelters to secretly harbor runaway slaves and help them to escape from the South to the North. David Ruggles invited Frederick to stay in his home. Frederick later sent for Anna Murray, and they were married. They immediately moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford was a whaling town and a likely place for Frederick to find a job as a ship caulker. Massachusetts was also a strong abolitionist state, making it one of the safest states for runaway slaves. But it was not entirely free of slave catchers. When they arrived in New Bedford, Frederick and his wife found a prosperous black family who offered them lodging. As a precaution against the possibility of being captured by slave catchers, Frederick changed his last name from Bailey to Douglas. In the coming years, the name of Frederick Douglass would be widely known throughout the United States and Canada. Massachusetts allowed Frederick to see and experience what a free state was like. He was amazed to find that many free blacks in the North lived better than some slave owners in the South. In the North, industry and ingenuity were relied upon rather than slave labor. Industry thrived and thus raised the living standards in the North above that of their Southern counterparts. The Northerners spent their time inventing ways to accomplish tasks through the use of technology, while the creativity of slave owners in the South was stifled by dependence upon slave labor. Douglass saw how industry worked when it did not depend upon raw human force. Although Massachusetts allowed Frederick to enjoy freedom from the brutality and injustice of slavery, there was still a great deal of racism. Whites did not want to work with blacks, and this made it difficult for black people to find decent employment. Frederick was not able to find work as a caulker and had to work at other menial tasks. He shoveled coal, loaded and unloaded ships, and operated a bellows in a brass furnace. It was inevitable that Frederick would become involved in the abolitionist movement. He was greatly inspired after reading an abolitionist paper called The Liberator. The paper was published by William Lloyd Garrison, one of the best-known and most outspoken abolitionists in America and the leader of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison was a controversial figure because he spoke so passionately against slavery. He attacked organized religion because white churches refused to take a stand on the issue of slavery. Douglass read every issue of The Liberator he could get. "The paper became my meat and drink," said Douglass. "My soul was set on fire." Frederick joined the Black Zion Methodist Church and later served as a minister there. He used every opportunity to speak out against the institution of slavery. There were also several African colonization movements during his time, advocating that blacks should return to Africa. But he opposed them because he believed that America was as much the home of blacks as it was of whites. Douglass became noted as an abolitionist speaker after being invited to speak at an anti-slavery society meeting in August 1841. William Coffin, an abolitionist from New Bedford, had heard him speak earlier at a church service, and as they waited for the meeting to start, he asked Douglass to address the audience. Douglass was taken completely by surprise and was overtaken with fear as he mounted the platform. He began to stammer, and his speech was halting, but as the crowd encouraged him, he became more and more at ease. The mostly white audience had never heard about the brutalities of slavery from one who had been a victim of the system. Most had been told by white Southerners that slaves were unintelligent, subhuman, and only suited for manual labor, and that the slaves were happy to serve their masters. A flood of pro-slavery propaganda had been unleashed upon the Northern whites in an attempt to combat the abolitionist movement. The common story was that slaves worked only until noon and were treated humanely, living in better conditions than most Northern laborers. But they listened, spellbound, as Douglass shared his life and experiences as a slave in America. He shared in detail how his mother had been taken away from him at birth, about the cruel beatings he had endured, and how he passed out from exhaustion. Douglass told stories about the brutal beatings that slave masters administered to women, children, and the elderly, and about masters breeding their female slaves. But he also lightened the atmosphere by telling some of the humorous incidents, like how he broke the slave breaker Edward Covey. He gained special delight in imitating the Southern white ministers who warned slaves that they would be offending God if they disobeyed their masters. He shared how he learned to read and write and gained the necessary skills to survive in the free world. His speech was most impressive. The audience was captivated by the way he confidently carried himself, as well as by his rich, deep speaking voice. Garrison was so taken with Frederick that he invited him to become a regular speaker. He quickly became a rising star on the anti-slavery speaking circuit. His life experiences gave him much to speak about. He was able to keep his audience mesmerized with stories of the cruelty and inhumanity of slavery. Douglass gave his life to the work of speaking out against slavery and racial oppression. The speaking circuit was rewarding but also perilous. The schedule of the speaking tours was grueling. Often he had to speak every night. As Douglass traveled to some of the western states, he met with open hostility. Often mobs of pro-slavery whites would attack the speakers and members of the audience as well. On one occasion in Pendleton, Indiana, Douglass's arm was broken by a mob of armed pro-slavery hooligans. In addition, he was treated harshly when he traveled for refusing to sit in Negro sections. But he was not deterred from continuing his work. Douglass spent hours honing his speaking skills. He studied the delivery styles of other great speakers and read widely, applying what he learned to his own style of delivery. His diction, articulation, and clarity of speech became so refined that some accused him of never having been a slave at all. The rumor that he had never been a slave and was simply making up his stories began to spread. This rumor prompted him to write a narrative about his life and experiences. He used his own name, giving very specific details, and this put his freedom in serious jeopardy. But he had weighed the consequences of his decision and deeply felt that his credibility was more important than his safety. He published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. The book became an instant bestseller. People all over the United States were reading about the escaped slave turned abolitionist. His instant fame made him even more visible and vulnerable to the slave catchers. He felt it was time to think about his safety and so decided to travel to Europe. Frederick was reluctant to leave his wife and family. He and Anna now had 4 children, Rosetta, Louis, Frederick, and Charles. This made his decision to leave very difficult, but both his safety and his freedom were at stake. So, in 1845, he set sail for England. His reputation as an abolitionist speaker had preceded him to England. Once he arrived, he had a flood of speaking opportunities. Frederick found that the attitudes about race and color were not much of an issue in England. Slavery had been abolished years prior, and the racist codes of segregation and discrimination that became so much of American politics and culture were never part of European life. Consequently, this had a positive effect on the attitude of the European people toward blacks. Frederick was treated with much greater equality and respect than in America. I gaze around in vain for one who will question my equal humanity, claim me as a slave, or offer me an insult, he said in absolute wonderment. He was amazed at this near absence of racial prejudice. He spoke in England, Scotland, and Ireland. The people received him warmly and supported his work. He was able to make many influential friends during his stay in England. Frederick spent 2 full years in England, and despite the kind treatment, became increasingly homesick and felt the urgent need to return to America and his family and to continue his work against the institution of slavery. However, he was still concerned about the possibility of being captured and returned to slavery once in America. So, several of his European friends collected $710.96 to purchase his freedom. They made arrangements to give the money to Thomas All prior to Frederick's return to America. This made Douglass a free man at last. He no longer had to be on constant vigilance for slave catchers. He arrived back in America in 1847. During his absence, he had become very popular as an anti-slavery leader. His book had kept him in the public mind, and those who fought against slavery and for equal rights for all of American citizens were very happy to have him return to the cutting edge of the struggle. Shortly after his return, Frederick moved his family from Massachusetts to Rochester, New York, and started his own abolitionist paper, the North Star. He addressed the cause of freedom and equality for African Americans, but like William Lloyd Garrison, he also addressed the cause of women and worked with the women's movement to abolish both slavery and discrimination against women. He met and became acquainted with women leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott. In 1851, he changed the name of his paper from the North Star to Frederick Douglass's paper. He fought for the desegregation of the Rochester public schools, and in 1847, the white and black children of Rochester, New York, were allowed to attend school together. He fought segregation and discrimination wherever he found it. When riding public transportation, he refused to move to Negro sections and often had to be forcibly and violently removed. He was physically injured on several occasions, but never wavered in his determination to challenge the racial injustices of American society. All of the efforts of the abolitionists seemed to be suddenly in vain when 2 new pieces of legislation gave the slave owners major political victories. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 declared that a slave owner had the legal right to pursue an escaped slave into any free state and return him to slavery. In addition, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857 handed down what today is known as the Dred Scott decision, declaring that blacks in America had no legal rights as citizens. The case involved a slave named Dred Scott who was owned by a man named John Emerson. When Emerson moved from a slave state to a free one, taking Scott with him, Scott went to court to try to obtain his freedom, realizing he was on free soil. After hearing the argument, the Supreme Court ruled that a slave had no rights as American citizens, even if they escaped to and lived in free northern states. The Dred Scott decision was a major setback, not only for the abolitionist movement, but for free blacks as well, because their freedom was also put in jeopardy by these new laws, which stripped away their rights. Before these two decisions were handed down, slave bounty hunters had to secretly kidnap a runaway slave, avoiding Northern authorities, to return him to his master. But the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act required Northern authorities to cooperate with the slave catchers in apprehending runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act even made it a crime for anyone to aid or harbor a fugitive slave. Many felt that a revolution against the tyranny of the American government was justified. After all, the American Revolution was started over issues that were far less oppressive than that of slavery. One such abolitionist was John Brown. Brown was a white man who deeply resented the institution of slavery and was openly hostile to slavery and slaveholders. He made no attempt to conceal the fact that he was willing to take up arms to overthrow slavery in America. For many years, John Brown had conducted an underground railroad station, helping runaway slaves escape to the North and helping them find employment and the necessities for their subsequent survival. But in 1859, he went a giant leap further and attempted to launch a revolution. His plan was to take over a weapons storehouse in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and continue throughout the countryside, taking arms, arming slaves, and building into a major revolution. But word of his plan was leaked to government officials, and armed soldiers were ready for his attack. He and his men, including his own sons, were trapped in the storehouse and overwhelmed by government troops. Brown and those who followed him were tried for treason and executed by hanging. Douglas and Brown had become friends prior to the attempted rebellion. Brown had shared his plans with Douglas and invited him to join them, but seeing flaws in the plan, Douglas declined. The letters they had written discussing the plans were discovered, and Douglas's arrest as a co-conspirator was sought. When he heard this, Douglas fled to Canada and later to England. The charges against him were later dropped, and he returned to America. While he was away, the debate over the issue of slavery became more and more heated, and America inched closer and closer to civil war. The decade that brought the American Civil War was also the decade that brought about the liberation of African Americans. The rumblings of war were only the ripples from a huge stone that had been thrown into the sea when the first Africans were chained and put aboard ships bound for America. Judgment against a nation of slave traders had already been handed down, but the wheels of justice and judgment were only now reaching the guilty. Africans had resisted being enslaved from the beginning, but centuries would pass before the collective acts of resistance exerted by generations of oppressed people would take its toll on a system doomed to fall. African Americans were joined by whites of goodwill who loathed the injustice of slavery. Like continual drops of water upon the proverbial rock, every gesture of resistance had its own effect against the system. No matter how minuscule a singular act of opposition seemed to be, when it was numbered along with all the others, there were enough straws to break the camel's back. Frederick Douglass had added his voice of reason to the many others in an attempt to appeal to the consciences of the slave owners. But they were proven to have no consciences, and so the stormy clouds of war began drifting toward America. The issue of slavery had been a sensitive one, and it became even more sensitive as the abolitionist movement gained momentum. As America expanded its borders to encompass new territory, and these new territories vied to become states, the question of whether they would become slave or free states arose and threatened to split the Union. In 1850, a congressman named Henry Clay stuck his finger in the dike by proposing a compromise. The compromise admitted California as a free state, but left it up to New Mexico and Utah to decide the matter for themselves. But the compromise of 1850 only stalled the inevitable and would preserve peace for only a decade. During that decade, the North grew steadily in population and technological resources. It was much better prepared to fight the war and preserve the Union in 1860 than it would have been in 1850. During this decade, the hand of fate would orchestrate the elements which would again bring the issue of slavery to the forefront and so polarize the North and South that they would explode into civil strife. First of all, a new party, the Republican Party, was formed in 1854 on the platform of opposing the extension of slavery. Secondly, The voices of those free blacks who were in a position to speak out against slavery did so vehemently. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass were three prominent black leaders in the anti-slavery movement. They commanded large audiences when they spoke and were effective at keeping the injustices of slavery before the people. A number of other influential blacks were prolific writers. In general, writing against the institution of slavery gave blacks their widest opportunity for self-expression. The most important writers were largely former slaves who had either run away or been set free by their masters. Frederick wrote 3 autobiographies: Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, and 10 years later, My Bondage and My Freedom, and finally, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Other former slaves also wrote slave narratives. William Wells Brown wrote about his travels to foreign places in 3 years in Europe, published in 1852. Brown was the first African American to write a play, The Escape, or Leap to Freedom, which appeared in 1858. He also wrote Clotel, or The President's Daughter, the first novel by an African American, which was published in London in 1853 and in the United States the following year. Another former slave, James W.C. Pennington, who had received the degree of Doctor of Divinity from the University of Heidelberg, published a textbook on the origin and history of the colored people in 1841. As more Northerners moved into the anti-slavery camp, Southerners became more and more angry because of their stand against slavery. Frederick Douglass's paper did its part by agitating for the North to take action against the Southern states and the slave trade they engaged in. The North Star had a fairly large subscription and a far-reaching effect. These abolitionist activities caused the crack of polarization between the North and South to widen. It finally split into a great gulf when the new Republican Party elected Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States. When word that Lincoln had been elected reached the South, events moved rapidly. Throughout the presidential campaign, the South had threatened to secede from the Union if a Republican was elected, and now South Carolina had made good the threat. Other states followed. This turn of events was the tolling of the bell for America because it meant that the hammer of judgment was about to fall. But for the slaves and free blacks, it was tidings of great joy. The Southern states formed a new nation from the states that had broken away from the U.S. and called it the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States was made up of only 11 states with a population of only 9 million people, including 3.5 million slaves, compared to the Union's 23 states with a population of 22 million people. The Civil War was forced upon President Lincoln when the rebel army of these newly confederated states fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in 1861. From the very beginning, Mr. Lincoln tried to keep slavery from becoming an issue in the war. Although he personally opposed slavery, nevertheless, he made it clear that his purpose in the war was not to free the slaves, but to save the Union. But Providence forced his hand, and he had to make a decision to either free the slaves or lose the war, and with it the Union. The American Civil War was the climax of a struggle that had been going on for several generations and was about to unleash upon America the bloodiest war that had ever been fought on American soil. Many believe that the war was God's judgment upon America for its centuries of brutal and inhumane treatment of slaves and its smug religious hypocrisy. On the one hand, Americans raped, barbarized, and dehumanized the Africans, and on the other hand, they called themselves Christian people building a Christian nation. Douglass was very critical of what he deemed a false representation of Christianity. Because of the heavy criticism he heaped upon the religious slaveholders in his autobiography, he was concerned that some might get the impression that he was hostile toward all forms of Christianity. To be sure that his readers understood his position, he wrote an appendix to his narrative, and there he expressed his own love and devotion to what he referred to as pure Christianity, contrasted against his loathing for the corrupt form of Christianity which had justified the enslavement of others. He wrote, "What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be the minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me at the class on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of the God who made me. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influence and leaves them to the ravages of wholesale pollution. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relations is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant and the hearth desolate. We see the thief preaching against theft and the adulterer against adultery. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babes sold to purchase Bibles for the poor heathens, all for the glory of God and the good of souls. Here we have religion and robbery, the allies of each other, devils dressed in angels' robes, and hell presenting the semblance of paradise, from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This scathing rebuke of those who claim to practice Christianity while participating in the slave trade is a revelation into the passion with which Douglass opposed both slavery and the kind of religion that harbored and fostered it. Douglass was just as outraged by the corrupting of Christianity and the gross misrepresentations of the true teachings of Christ as he was to the institution of slavery itself. He was a Christian who was appalled by what he saw masquerading as Christianity. The Confederate generals prayed to God for guidance and victory over those who would bring an end to the institution of slavery, but divine providence declared that it was not to be. For a time it appeared that their prayers were being answered. At first it appeared that God was with the southern states in this war. The North had abundantly more resources than the South and outnumbered them more than 2-1, but still found themselves losing to the Confederates in one battle after another. It is widely believed that the North was losing because they had not declared the right cause, the abolition of slavery. So adamant was President Lincoln about keeping the issue of slavery out of the war that he would command the Northern generals to return those slaves who escaped over the line to join the North to their Southern owners. Lincoln did this mainly as a political move, not wanting to offend the slave-holding border states that had not yet seceded from the Union and joined the South. But slave labor was a great asset to the South, and the food and other goods produced by the slaves helped sustain their war effort. This finally became clear to the president, but still he refused to pass any laws freeing the slaves. Although President Lincoln tried to bypass the issue of slavery, it appeared that the Almighty was moving the hand of public opinion against him. The voices of leading abolitionists like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and others were not still. They clamored for Lincoln to take action to make slavery the issue and free the slaves outright. When she returned to the North after one of her rescue missions, Harriet Tubman criticized the president, saying, "They may send the flower of their young men down south to die of fever in the summer and the plague in the winter. They may send them 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, till they tire of sending or use up the young men, all of no use. God won't let Mr. Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing. Mr. Lincoln is a great man and I a poor Negro woman. But this Negro can tell Mr. Lincoln how to save the money and the young men. He can do it by setting the Negroes free. This humble little woman could see clearly what the president could not see at all, that God was demanding justice for the slaves and was refusing to compromise on this issue. It never occurred to Mr. Lincoln that relieving the oppressed was of far greater interest to God than preserving the Union. Lincoln failed to realize that there is no true union without justice. Frederick Douglass led a campaign to try to persuade the president to free the slaves. He later wrote of his belief that the mission of the war was the freedom of the slaves as well as the salvation of the Union. Finally, one lone general, General Benjamin Franklin Butler, refused to release 3 runaway slaves when their owner asked for them back. He would not permit the owner to reclaim them, saying that the slaves were contraband. This opened the floodgates, and hundreds of slaves began escaping across the Union line, seeking asylum as contraband. Lincoln finally saw the handwriting on the wall and issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But even this was a half-hearted effort that was thrust upon him. Harriet Tubman suspected that the only reason he had gone this far was to strengthen the Union Army by accepting many of the freed slaves into armed services because the North was losing so many men in the war. President Lincoln announced on January 1, 1863, that slaves in states or parts of states in arms against the Union should be thenceforward, and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation was only a declaration of freedom. True freedom could only be granted when the war was won. In addition, the proclamation only applied to slaves in the rebel states. It did not affect the slaves of the border states that had not joined in the rebellion against the Union. It would take an amendment from Congress in 1864 to abolish slavery permanently from the United States and all states under its jurisdiction. Although the North could not enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in the South, it nevertheless had the effect of prompting large numbers of slaves to run away to where Union soldiers were occupying Southern territory. Douglass was elated to hear about the Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote, "The news was like a bolt from the sky, the dawn of a new day, the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." The battle against the South was taking a toll on Union forces. They desperately needed more soldiers. After a time of debate and controversy over whether or not to allow blacks to fight in the war, Lincoln decided to recruit them. Douglass enthusiastically led an enlistment campaign to recruit black soldiers into the Union Army. Black men responded en masse all across the nation. They were joining up to fight against the Confederacy and the institution of slavery. The 54th Regiment of Massachusetts was the first of many more black regiments in America. But the black soldiers soon discovered that racism had followed them into the armed forces. They were only paid half of what the white soldiers received. They were grossly mistreated by the white officers. They were inadequately trained and given meager rations and supplies, and shorted in the area of such vital supplies as shoes, weapons, and uniforms. As soon as Douglass heard about the mistreatment of black enlisted men, he stopped his recruitment campaign. He sought a meeting with President Lincoln and received one. He met with the president in the summer of 1863. Douglass was deeply impressed with Lincoln's character and became convinced that he was an honest and trustworthy man. He discussed the ill treatment that black soldiers were enduring and received assurance from Lincoln that he would do what he could to solve the problem. Satisfied with this, Douglass resumed his recruitment activities. Despite the kind of injustice they endured in the armed forces, blacks continued to enlist in droves. More than 200,000 black soldiers joined the Union Armed Forces, and over 38,000 were killed or wounded. These black soldiers proved their mettle. They fought valiantly and dispelled any doubts about the depths of their courage and valor. The strength of these newly recruited black Union soldiers helped turn the tide of the war. General George Meade and Tecumseh Sherman began to rout the Southern rebels. They devastated the armies of the South, finally pummeling them into submission. On April 2nd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, was captured by General U.S. Grant. 7 days later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. 5 days after this, John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer and pro-slavery advocate, assassinated Lincoln in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The nation was shocked, outraged, and deeply saddened by the loss of President Lincoln. Blacks and whites could be seen weeping on the streets. A nation was in mourning. Frederick Douglass attended President Lincoln's funeral and honored the man who had successfully saved the Union and held a nation together, but the heavy toll was the blood of thousands. Lincoln was laid to rest, and the nation now had to face the task of trying to heal itself of the wounds of war. Much of the South had to be rebuilt or reconstructed, including a government which would not be prone to another rebellion against the Union. During the Reconstruction period of 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was approved by Congress. This amendment outlawed slavery in all of U.S. territory. Blacks all over America and the whites who sympathized with them were jubilant. They celebrated the abolition of slavery, but the days of their jubilation was cut short by the actions of Andrew Johnson, a Southern sympathizer, who succeeded Lincoln and took the Oval Office as President of the United States. The white Southerners were filled with animosity toward the Union, but even more so toward the newly freed slaves who were now their neighbors. They had absolutely no intentions of treating blacks justly and were given license to terrorize them by Johnson's apathetic attitude. He did not hide the fact that he was not sympathetic to Southern blacks and worked to keep power in the hands of Southern whites by appointing men to government who shared their attitude toward the former slaves. The U.S. government showed more gratitude to those who had committed treason against it than to those who had loyally fought and died to support it. Andrew Johnson went even further in demonstrating his support for the Southerners by withdrawing the federal troops from Southern soil and leaving the free blacks at the mercy of hostile Southern whites. They immediately established the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, a set of laws and policies that stripped all citizenship rights from blacks, including the right to vote. They could not own land and were shut out of all but the most humiliating types of work. They could be arrested and forced to work without pay if they were found to be unemployed. In addition, white terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were organized with the objective of harassing and terrorizing blacks into accepting a permanent place of subordination. The Klan wore white sheets and hoods to conceal their identity and rolled throughout the South, burning homes, raping, beating, and even murdering innocent black citizens. Johnson did all he could to keep the government in the South in the hands of racist politicians. In order to fight Johnson, Douglass joined forces with the Radical Republicans, a wing of the party whose goal was to bring about positive changes for blacks in America. He worked with Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner in an effort to gain civil rights for blacks. They won a major victory in 1866 when Congress passed two bills, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill provided medical, educational, and financial assistance to the former slaves. The Civil Rights Bill provided for citizenship rights for all black Americans. Johnson had tried to veto both bills but was defeated. Those who fought so hard to get the Civil Rights Bill signed into law were soon disappointed to see that the laws would have no teeth because they would not be enforced by Johnson and subsequent administrations. It would require a 14th Amendment under the Constitution to protect these new rights, and even this new amendment would prove ineffective in stopping those who were bent on preventing America's black citizens from enjoying their citizenship rights. And so, for 100 years, neither the Civil Rights Bill nor the 14th Amendment would bring about full citizenship status for Southern and, in many instances, even Northern blacks. The Southern states, with Johnson's support, were successful in preventing blacks from enjoying voting rights and the rights of full American citizenship that were extended to white Southerners. Douglass refused the position of supervisor over the Freedmen's Bureau after having it offered by Johnson because he did not trust Johnson and opposed his racist views. In 1868, with Douglass's help, Andrew Johnson was defeated and Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency. Douglas had judged Grant to be a man who would move to secure civil rights for blacks, and he was not disappointed with Grant's efforts. With Grant's support, the U.S. Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which extended the vote to every black man in America. But the Southern politicians countered the move by establishing bogus poll tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses to prohibit many blacks from voting. Nevertheless, many blacks did vote, and for the first time in American history, black congressmen, senators, and other high-ranking officials were elected to office. Douglas was very much encouraged by these developments. His hopes and optimism soared over the future of the nation that he loved so dearly, despite the unjust treatment he and fellow blacks had endured at her hand. In 1872, Douglas moved to Washington, D.C., after his home in Rochester caught fire and was destroyed. He began working for the New National Era, a civil rights newspaper. He also became president of a black bank, the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, but the bank later folded. In 1887, Douglas was appointed U.S. Marshal of Washington, D.C. by the new president, Rutherford B. Hayes. He purchased a large house on 15 acres of land and named his new estate Cedar Hill. Frederick settled into his new home and began work on his new book, an autobiography entitled The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. After a time, he began thinking about his former life as a slave and couldn't help but wonder about the place he grew up in and those who held him in bondage. His curiosity finally got the better of him, and he decided to visit his former master, Thomas Auld. He made the arrangements and traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, and met with Auld. Frederick wrote of that peculiar experience. Now that slavery was destroyed, the slave and the master stood on equal ground. Auld was no longer to me a slaveholder, either in fact or in spirit, and I regarded him as I did myself, a victim of circumstances of birth, education, law, and custom. In 1882, his wife Anna died, and after enduring 2 years of loneliness, Frederick married Helen Pitts of Rochester, New York. Helen Pitts was 20 years younger than Frederick and white. Because of these differences, especially Helen's white skin, a great deal of controversy swirled around the marriage. But Frederick was not the kind of man who allowed the opinions of others to dictate his life and affairs. He traveled to Europe, and upon his return to America and his travels through the Southland, he was jolted back to action as a human rights activist by the oppression and poverty blacks were still enduring in the South. He was later appointed American Consul General to Haiti and spent the rest of his life fighting for justice and equality for people of African descent. On February 20th, 1895, Frederick Douglass died of a heart attack while in his home at Cedar Hill. He had attended a women's rights meeting that evening where he was honored for his work on behalf of the feminist movement. Frederick was approximately 77 years old when he died. Although the abolition of slavery was only one step on the long road of freedom and equality for African Americans, it nevertheless was a giant step. The abolition of slavery was the single most far-reaching event in African American history to date. The end of the American Civil War and victory by the North convinced African Americans that justice for them had finally arrived in America. But they were disappointed to discover that the road to justice and equality stretched beyond another 100 years. The road to freedom proved to be long, difficult, and perilous, with many disappointments along the way. But with the success of the Civil War, the gate to that road had been opened and the long march had begun. Gains that were won during the Reconstruction period of the South were summarily lost again. New freedoms that were briefly enjoyed by blacks were immediately taken away by Jim Crow laws and the black codes. Life was destined to be a continual struggle for African Americans for more than another 100 years. But they struggled on with a dogged determination which would eventually regain ground that had been taken away. The road to freedom and equality for African Americans has already been 1.5 centuries long since the American Civil War. But it is interesting to note that 100 years after the fateful decade that led up to and encompassed the American Civil War, another fateful decade came about, the decade that birthed the Civil Rights Movement. It began in 1954 with a landmark Supreme Court decision from the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. This decision, reversing all segregation in public schools, was the first domino which would eventually topple all the laws, black codes, and discriminatory policies which had been in existence in America since the time of Reconstruction. This decision was immediately followed the next year by the Montgomery bus boycott against segregated transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. These boycotts were successful and officially unleashed a torrent of other peaceful protests against Jim Crow laws, including marches, sit-ins, wait-ins, and freedom rides. The result of these protests was the passage and vigorous enforcement of a series of laws prohibiting segregation, discrimination, and denial of the right to vote in any part of the United States of America. This was the sweet fruit from hundreds of years of earnest prayers, hard struggle, and great sacrifices. With the success of the struggle for civil rights for African Americans and the passage of laws guaranteeing those rights, America has come closer to fulfilling its promise of freedom and equality to all of its citizens. However, it is the lot and responsibility of each generation to jealously guard those rights while continuing the struggle for a more perfect union. Bibliography: Frederick Douglass, Rising Up from Slavery, by Francis E. Ruffin, Sterling Publishing Company, 2008. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, by Frederick Douglass, 1968 Penguin Books. Frederick Douglass, Abolitionist, editor Sharman Russell, 1988, Chelsea House Publishers. Frederick Douglass, Voice of Liberty, by Melissa Banter, 1993, Chelsea House Publishers. Frederick Douglass and the Fight for Freedom, by Douglas T. Miller, 1988, by Douglas T. Miller. Harriet Tubman, Slavery and the Underground Railroad, Megan McLeod, Silver Burdett Press, 1991. U.S. History, Heritage and Freedom, Becker Book Publications, 1993. Ebony Pictorial History of Black America, Volume 1, Johnson Publishing Company, 1971.